Hey, Guru Nation, welcome back to the clinicaltrialsguru.com. Thank you very much for watching or listening in this case, as it's audio only, but it'll be on iTunes and Stitcher, as well as YouTube, and eventually on the blog, theclinicaltrialsguru.com. So, I used to do lots of interviews. I've gotten away from that recently just because we've been so busy and there's been a lot of micro content I've been producing. But I met Kristin.Mauri, who's the global head of risk-based monitoring at Bioclinica. I met her at Scope conference in 2016. So hello to those of you watching in the future. Um, Met her there, fascinated by Bioclinica, by what she's doing there. And she actually reached out and said, hey, anytime you want to do an interview, she's very gracious. So we finally scheduled it. And thank you, Kristin, for coming on the podcast today.
For having me, Dan.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? We're going to get into Bioclinica, we're going to get into risk-based monitoring, but just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this industry, because a lot of people are at that stage in their careers right now.
Sure. So I got started in the industry in the early 90s, and my first foray into the pharmaceutical industry was through an internship when I was in college, starting in the finance department, where I was working with the teams to help make investigator payments for clinical trials. When I graduated college, I took a full-time position back with SmithKline Beecham, working in their finance department, doing the same thing, working around investigator payments. And at the time, SmithKline Beecham was very innovative in thought process around how to grow young talent in their company. And they started a program for young college graduates to come into the clinical operations team and essentially be an apprentice to a clinical research associate and learn the business and how to become a CRA. So I had an opportunity to be a part of that program. I was in it for 4 years, where I worked side by side with a mentor, learning the role of a CRA. And so that was how I got started. I stayed with SmithKline Beecham for about 7 years. From there, I moved on into various roles in the industry, always on the clinical operations side of the business, managing clinical trials, overseeing clinical programs, and then eventually becoming the head for a small biotech company for the entire clinical operations organization. I made a switch to the software side of the business in the mid 2000s, and that is where I have spent the rest of my time. And as you mentioned, I'm currently responsible at Bioclinica for our risk-based monitoring business, including a software product that we have to support risk-based monitoring, and a other side of the business I'm responsible for is the professional services and consulting around risk-based monitoring in general.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So thank you for sharing. So so you started out in finance. Was your background in finance? Is that what you studied it in college?
I have a business degree, and interestingly, at the time, I was given the opportunity to go into a role that is typically reserved for college graduates that have some type of science degree. Um, at the time, SmithKline thought that they could train individuals around the science, and they just wanted um, individuals that had the skill set to be able to go out and work with the investigators and problem solve and analyze the data. And so I fit that portion of their expectation and learned the science along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But Definitely not a typical, I would say, typical background for a CRA at the time in the 90s.
Correct. Now, I know a lot of those, like the investigator payments, there's now vendors that handle that. So do you think those opportunities are still there for someone who would have a business background, or should they just go directly for the CRA positions?
I think, I think all of the industry positions in and around the clinical operations space are changing. They're evolving. I think that a young individual looking for a career should not let their degree stop them. I think they should go for what they want to do. Yes, software has evolved tremendously, and in every aspect of clinical trials now, we're using software to support activities and make them more efficient. But there's always people needed to be the brain around operating the software, analyzing the data. So I think there's opportunity there in both directions, both in the CRO role, which is dramatically changing as we move into a new world of monitoring. And then also on the business side, that's will always be a need as well.
Right. Yeah, and you've seen the industry change just in, since the mid '90s. So,
Yeah.
and I have as well. I've been in the industry since the mid 2000s. I've seen it. I came in right at the tail end of paper CRFs. And then the next year, after my first year of being a coordinator, we made the switch to EDC. And I was pretty resistant to change, as most people are, but once you get used to it, just like most things in life, you realize that it's actually an improvement, and it reduces some of the inefficiencies. So let's get into risk-based monitoring, because that, at least for the last year, 2016, seems like the hot topic in this clinical research industry. And so for those people watching or listening, first of all, what is risk-based monitoring?
So I'll start off by saying risk-based monitoring to me is not about reducing monitoring visits. And I think there's a misperception in the industry for people who have not yet made the switch to risk-based monitoring that it is just about reducing monitoring costs, reducing activities on site. And I would say overall, it's really about using a different risk based process that includes the combination of people, process, and technology to have a more efficient and effective way to monitor clinical trials. But if we think about it in the sense of the definition, it's really risk-based monitoring is about putting in place a customized approach to each individual trial that is based on an early risk assessment done before the protocol is finalized to identify critical data and critical processes to that trial outcome to make sure that ultimately you have as high of data quality as possible while making sure that patient safety is of the utmost importance in the trial. So when we look at risk-based monitoring, it's more about identifying these risks up front and placing focus and activities around monitoring those particular processes, critical data points that, again, are going to lead to better safety and better data quality. So we see companies looking at potentially reduced SDV schedules. So picking those critical points on a case report form page that need to be monitored or SDV'd 100% because they tie back to a critical process or procedure, as well as looking at scheduling visits on an as needed basis. So with a traditional approach as CRAs, the normal schedule would be to visit the site somewhere between every 4 to 8 weeks, regardless of how the site was performing, regardless of the level of risk associated with that site. Now, in a risk-based world, we see there's no longer a fixed schedule. There is a constant monitoring of the data that is going on centrally, and then at appropriate time points, intervals, or as the need arises, monitoring visits occur.
Yeah, that's actually, thank you for sharing. So we'd love to have you on as a guest lecturer, just as a side note for our CRA Academy. So we'll definitely set that up soon, and I know a lot of the students in our academy are going to be happy to hear that. So okay, we understand risk-based monitoring now. Do what percentage, just a ballpark, what percentage of studies right now in October 2016 do you think are actually using risk-based monitoring? Because we do a lot of trials. They're not really branded as risk-based monitoring trials to the site. So we don't necessarily know which trials are being risk-based monitoring or having those strategies being used. Uh, do you have any ballpark data on that?
I don't, not unfortunately not in front of me, but from my gut feel and working with clients on a daily basis to understand their needs around risk-based monitoring, I think the first point here is that the definition of risk-based monitoring is very broadly, the term is very broadly used and it means different things to different companies. So it's difficult to put a percent attached to what trials are being done from an RBM perspective.
Right.
I, I do feel like we're seeing a larger percentage of trials using some kind of reduced SDV in combination with an SDR strategy, but that in and of itself is not risk-based monitoring. Truly risk-based monitoring goes back to the principles of quality by design, where there is this identification of items in the protocol early on during the development stage that may or may not bring risk to the trial. And from there, assessing which risks have ultimately have been identified that cannot be de-risked from the protocol in the beginning. So now we need to monitor them along the way, and some associated risk-based strategy or approach is aligned to that. So it's evolving. The industry adoption, acceptance of risk-based monitoring is evolving, and I think with the finalization of the upcoming ICH E6 R2 guidelines that are proposed to be finalized sometime by the end of this year, I think we'll see companies moving more rapidly to a risk-based approach to their trial execution.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue. So we are going to get into that, and I guess it makes sense what you just stated. Um, people like to compare the EDC back in the early to mid 2000s to risk-based monitoring, and yes, there are a lot of similarities, but with EDC, it was very objective. Like you're either using paper-based CRF or you're not. With risk-based monitoring, there's so many different elements to it. And some CROs may be using parts of risk-based monitoring elements for some trials, others for different trials. And I guess the most obvious facing tool for risk-based monitoring would be the remote source data verification, but then that's also done on site as well. So it'd be very difficult, and I could see why that would be very difficult to come up with a percentage of how many sites or how many studies are using risk-based monitoring. I think we should just assume that most are using elements of it in 2016 and definitely going forward, uh, in my opinion. So, uh, right. Okay. So let's get into ICH E6. So what's this revision about? And first of all, what is ICH E6?
So these are the guidelines that the industry follows for good clinical practice research. And these are um, guidelines that are followed in the US, Europe, and Japan, and other countries as well. But those are the three primary countries involved in ICH guidances and adoption. And so these guidelines are actually the revision to these guidelines that are expected to be finalized by the end of this year are the first revisions to the ICH guidelines in 19 years. And many of the experts in the industry feel that these guidelines are going to fundamentally change the way we run clinical trials. And so the changes to the guidelines, they cover many topics. They cover topics around investigator responsibilities, technology, and then sponsor responsibilities. And I think there's two sections in the guidance, proposed revisions, that are going to have the largest impact on sponsors and trial execution. And those are the revisions to Section 5.0, quality management, which is actually an entirely new section that has been added to the guidelines. So it's not being amended, it's being added. And then the other changes I feel are going to have a significant impact are the changes around monitoring, and they sit in section 5.18. So those are the two. Of course, there's many revisions, and companies need to go through and understand every single amendment revision that is occurring. But those two that I've just pointed out, I think, are the ones that are going to have this impact on the industry that is going to fundamentally change the way we execute.
I see. Didn't, and maybe I'm just ignorant here, but didn't the FDA release some kind of guidance in 2012 that sort of gave birth to this risk-based monitoring movement where they said 100% source data verification is not required?
Yeah, no, you're right, Dan. So there's actually been an evolution of regulatory guidance really dating back as far as 2007. In 2007, the then chief medical officer of CEDAR was Janet Woodcock, and she started speaking about quality by design in clinical development and promoting the fact that trials should be designed with a quality framework up front, thus de-risking the trial from the beginning, helping to drive quality throughout the process. Guidance has then evolved over time. We saw in 2009 the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which was a private public um, consortium that was formed to again promote quality by design and drive efficiencies through clinical trials. And then we got to 2013, where the FDA puts out a guidance and starts supporting risk-based monitoring practices. This FDA guidance that came out in 2013 followed the formation of Transcelerate, which occurred in 2012. And that was an industry group of pharmaceutical companies that got together, again, with the initiative and um, drive to help streamline and make trials more efficient. And one of their first initiatives that they worked on was risk-based monitoring. They put out a bunch of information, guidances on risk-based monitoring and how to deploy it in a trial. And right after that is when we saw the FDA coming out and promoting risk-based monitoring in their paper. Around the same time in 2013, we saw the EMA come out with some new guidances around risk-based monitoring. So in my opinion, these revisions to the ICH guidelines are an attempt by ICH to harmonize all the different guidances that have come out from regulatory bodies and consortiums over the last 8, 10 years and solidifying that and putting it into this new revision that we expect to see in the coming months.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thank you for clarifying that. So I guess we'll end with something I've been noticing, and I wasn't prepared to ask this question, but so I know we've talked before off the air, if you will, about my CRO. So for those that don't know, I'm launching a CRO this year, and we're starting to bid on our first projects. We're actually being utilized right now as vendors for other CROs, but eventually the goal is to be a full service CRO ourselves. DSCS, that's the CRO. So, Kristin, I mean, I've noticed. So, my competitive advantage, should I go the route of full service CRO, is the relationship I have with all the sites that I own, that I consult with, or that my company actually has equity in. And I thought I was unique until recently. I've noticed, and you don't have to comment if you can, but there's been a lot of CROs acquiring sites, and I I wasn't paying attention earlier, and by earlier I mean mid 2000s, to notice that this was not happening, or maybe it was. But recently, CROs have been acquiring sites, and it started with phase one sites, but now it's actually becoming all phases of studies. And Bioclinica, I think, didn't they recently acquire some sites? Do you know why this is? Is there a strategy there that, and I know Bioclinica is not a CRO. Um, do you have any insight you can give me into that?
Yeah, a little bit. So, Bioclinica is made up of actually three divisions, and one of our divisions is called the Global Clinical Research Division, and that division is solely focused on patient recruitment and retention, having a research network. So, as a part of that division, we do actually um, own and run clinical trial sites. In fact, we recently just acquired a company called Compass, which I believe has over 300 research sites in the Florida area, and my details might be a little off on that, but that is an important division for us. Bioclinica as a company, we grow by acquisition, and so in that business unit or pillar, we will continue to acquire clinical research sites. From the CRO perspective, I think it just makes sense for them to have a pipeline of sites that they can utilize when running clinical trials. As we all know in this industry, the pressure is on to have high quality sites that can enroll patients at the rates that sponsors are looking for. So when CROs own those relationships, it's easier for them to guarantee and feel confident that they're going to be able to meet the sponsor expectations.
Thank you for sharing, Kristen. So we're going to try to have you as a guest lecturer from time to time in our CRA Academy. if you would like. And if anyone wants to contact you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So they can contact me at Kristin, Kristin, dot Mauri, Mauri, at bioclinica.com. And Bioclinica is spelled Bioclinica.
Okay, very good. And I'll have the link underneath the video. So thanks again, Kristen, for coming on. I appreciate it. I think there was a lot of good insights here, not only in learning about your background and your career trajectory, but also where our industry is headed into the future. So I appreciate it and love to do this again anytime. Okay.
Thanks for having me on today, Dan. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and thank you everyone for listening and watching. This is Dan from theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Take care.